threatening assault on people. Go in there.
No.
We need a counterweight.
The fancy thing's too complicated.
Oh my. Zoom. We were zoomed in on a block in the wall over there.
Now we're on Devon's.
Devlin's face.
We don't want to see too much of that.
Like, almost everybody today. Almost.
We're missing Jacob and
Jacob.
And Haley.
Haley.
Jacob Word.
Alright.
Jacob Word.
Now he's on his way.
Did you read Revelation this week?
I'm to where we were supposed to be last week. That's how far I made
That's
it.
much closer
I'm,
than you were.
I'm catching up.
Much closer. Okay. Let's go back to the beginning. Is this the first class you've been in for Revelation?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I thought so. All right. Whenever we go back to the very beginning of Revelation, we need to remember, like, what is happening in this book, because we're jumping in the middle of the apocalyptic prophecy stuff, right? We are talking about beasts and horns and crowns and dragons and seals and scrolls and all kinds of stuff that is highly figurative. And we get lost trying to figure out what this stuff is talking about, who wrote this, when it was written, who it was written to, and what was that really important verse at the very beginning of the book. You need to have that one verse down to understand the rest of the book and the prophecies that are contained within it.
Revelation 1:3.
I don't remember the exact verse. The time is near.
Right?
Yes, there's another one somewhere floating around there. It's that these things were going to come to pass quickly. I should have written it down, went back and looked it up. But it's these things are going to happen soon.
That's verse
Not a long
1.
way down the road. Huh?
That's verse 1.
Verse 1.
Yeah, it is verse 1.
The things must soon take place. Thank you. I even have it underlined and zoomed right by it. Thank you. These things must soon take place. If you start trying to go back, take the stuff we're going to look at and say, well, these two horns are Russia and America because they're the two most prominent world powers that are fighting during the Cold War and blah, 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 nuclear bombs and other such stuff. There are no nuclear bombs in Revelation. Despite what a lot of people like to think and talk about, we live in an age where not as much in the Cold War, but still we live with this fear of, oh no, a nuclear winter could happen, a nuclear war could happen. And we have that looming over us to a small degree. At least if you've ever read some of the books that I've read. Makes you kind of scared. So, we live in an age where people like to take this stuff and try to apply it to today. That would have done no good to the people that got this book immediately. The people that were getting killed by the Roman government for their belief in Christ. Those people would have gotten nothing out of a prophecy about America and Russia. So, whenever we go into chapter 12, we need to remember that this was written to the people that were being persecuted. And what is the main theme of this book? If you had to condense it all down to one theme, what would it be?
End of time.
No. It has the end of time in it, but there's a theme that is through this entire book that is what the people then and the people today need to get out of this book.
Punishment.
That's one of the minor themes. There is punishment waiting for those that disobey God, right? That is one of the themes, but if we had to condense it down to one, what would it be?
If you stay faithful, you will win in the end.
Okay, be faithful. And no matter what happens, it's worth it, right? Faithfulness. A faithfulness that endures anything and everything that comes your way is what this book is entirely about. Because if you had your best friend, your family, or someone you love, just anybody in your congregation killed for their faith, it would rattle you. If it didn't rattle you, you wouldn't be human to be rattled at that point. But watching the stuff that was happening to these people, losing their livelihood and losing their very lives, was shaking some people. And God, through John, is telling them it's worth it. Stick with it, and it's worth it. And if it was worth it for them, it's worth it for us. So let's jump into chapter 12. I don't think we're going to get through 14. It's probably going to be 12 and 13, but we'll do the best we can to make some ground. We switch. Let's go back and talk about the tail end of chapter 11 first. The tail end of chapter 11, we see God. His temple in heaven is open. The Ark of the Covenant was there. We remember what the Ark of the Covenant signifies. The very presence of God with his people in that temple. Who is the temple of God?
The church.
The church, the people, us. We are the temple of God. And there were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. All attention getters. Whenever God was present on Mount Sinai in the form of a cloud, the people of Israel saw him and were shook to their very bones. I mean, they were in awe of God's presence. That is the same thing that will happen when we are in God's presence. He switches gears here and says, "And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars." What does 12 signify?
Complete.
All right, a completeness, right? What do we also have 12 of in the New Testament? What do we have 12 of in the Old Testament?
Tribes.
All right, we have the 12 tribes of Israel. Then, in the New Testament, we had 12 what?
Apostles.
Apostles. All right, and there were more disciples. Apostles are more specific than disciples. So we have the 12 apostles. Judas kills himself. What happened in Acts?
He's replaced.
They replaced him with, bonus points,
Methuselah.
Matthias. Sounds like Methuselah. It's easier to remember. But Matthias. So they have a Matthew and a Matthias. But you have a number of 12 apostles there. So the crown of 12 stars is representative as well as being complete. The doctrine that was brought to the church by the 12 apostles. Whenever the early church was founded, the apostles had a position of power that no one has had since, because they were establishing what the church should do, because they were inspired by God. So who is this woman clothed with the sun? Time is all messed up because we're starting on the even hour. All right. This is one of those things where if you don't get this right, the rest of this makes no sense for the rest of what we're talking about here with the woman. The woman is the church. Okay? If you look at the description of her, she is clothed with the sun. Whenever we become Christians, what are we clothed with, according to Galatians 3:27?
White robe.
No. Galatians 3:27 is pretty specific on what we are clothed with. Christ. Right. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. All right. So the visualization there is we put on Christ like a robe. Well, this woman is clothed with the brightness of the sun. Whenever we see Jesus represented twice so far in Revelation, we see him represented with a face that is shining. He's so bright you can't even look into his form and see his appearance because of that bright shining light. So we have a woman clothed with the sun. S-U-N, not S-O-N, but it's representative of being clothed with Christ. So this is the church. She has the crown of the doctrine of the 12 apostles on top of her head. She's pregnant and crying out in birth pains and agony of giving birth. If you see a woman pregnant going down the road and she's very pregnant, you can look at her and say, obvious thing here, she's getting ready to have a baby sometime soon. She's going to bring forth offspring. The church, we sometimes don't view the church like this, but the church is like a pregnant woman ready to bring forth offspring. The church grows through people being added to the church. But the church, the members of the body, are the ones that spread Christianity around, and new converts are brought forth through the church, us Christians. So the church is ready to bring forth new Christians. But childbirth is a painful process. I don't know if any of you have ever been present for a birth. You've seen it on TV probably where somebody's having a baby. It's not the same thing as being in the room when it's happening or actually having a child. That's never happened to me, but some of you might get to experience that in life. But it's a painful process. Sometimes the church bringing forth new converts into existence is a painful process. Stephen, in Acts chapter 8, he was trying to bring forth new converts by teaching the truth. And what happened to Stephen?
Stoned.
He was stoned to death, right? He wasn't stoned just a little, he was stoned to death. A lot of these people are trying to convert other people and are losing their lives, their homes, and their livelihoods for it. And sometimes people just flat out reject you, and it's painful emotionally. But the church is always ready to bring forth new converts. Not a single mother that I know would ever say having my child was not worth going through labor. Even though it's painful, it is totally worth it. All right, verse 3. Another sign appeared in heaven, a great dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. Who do we think this dragon is?
Satan.
Oh, Satan seems like a really good answer, doesn't it? I mean, Satan was a serpent in the garden, and it seems like a dragon is an evil adversary. I mean, just look at Sleeping Beauty. You know, the good prince had to go fight the evil dragon. It's not Satan in this case. It is most likely Rome. Rome. Who was the entity that was persecuting the church during the time that this was written? Rome, right? The Roman government. Now, this is interesting. I learned this from doing some reading. Rome was on 7 hills. The city of Rome existed on 7 hills that were all together. And there were 10 provinces of Rome. So that makes sense why there were 10 horns on the 7 heads. And it most likely represents, or the crowns represent 7 kings. We actually find that a few chapters later, 5 chapters later, that the 7 crowns on the dragon are 7 kings. So Rome was trying its very best at this point to crush out the church, to stomp it from existence. Let's look at what Rome is going to do, or is in the attempt of doing, trying to do during this time. I'm really messing that up. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to earth. So they were doing their best to take the stars in an elevated position, the saints, and kill them, or at least force them to not convert. We don't have any exact numbers, but I don't know how many Christians at the point of death or losing their livelihood or their families said, okay, I'll give it up. But at least a few had to have, just out of sheer numbers and human nature, they would have given up their faith when faced with that. So Rome was trying to do that. The dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. They were trying their very best to squash new converts. All right, as soon as a person becomes a Christian, I don't think there's any way you could argue that they are not at their most vulnerable. Whenever a person is a brand new Christian, they are at a vital stage. Whenever a human child is brought into this world, are they capable of defending themselves the same way they can when they're 30?
No.
No, not even close, right? There's that maturity difference between a brand new baby and a 30-year-old. So the government was in a place where they could kill, or at least make them fall away, a brand new Christian. And that is what they were trying to do. But she gave birth to one male child who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Her child was caught up to God and his throne. If you will look to God, God will protect you. Even as a brand new Christian. Right? Even as a brand new Christian, if you are looking to God and have your mind in the right place, you will be safe. And the woman fled into the wilderness, and she has a place prepared for her by God. We don't see the church through the entire history of humanity, from its existence on. Records are not what they used to be. The Dark Ages, they didn't have Facebook and websites and everything kept up to date where you could just be like, oh, well, here's a website from 1200 AD. Oh, there was a congregation in Wales. Oh, that's great. Just because we don't see it throughout human history doesn't mean that it didn't exist. What does it take for the church to exist? In its most bare, basic explanation, what does it take for the church to exist?
Christians.
All right, let's go back and say there's no Christians in a community. What do you have to do, or what are the basic elements that it takes to form the church?
Follow God.
A preacher.
Yeah. There are people that have been converted without an actual preacher.
Faithfulness.
That helps a lot.
Understanding like what
Even
the
more,
plan for
even more
salvation
basic,
is.
even more basic. What does it take?
I'm not following you here.
The Bible.
All right. We're going to combine those two together. The Word of God and people, a desire to follow God, and those three things put together. If they actually do what God says with the Word of God, then you have the church formed at that place. It doesn't take a sign out front. It doesn't take a website. It doesn't take a bulletin mailed out to every house in the community. It doesn't take a billboard on 65. If you have those things in their most basic forms put together, you have the church. And so just because we don't see the church in a prominent place the same way we see the Catholic Church or the Lutheran Church throughout history, we can know that the church existed in a place prepared for it by God. A place that was safe where it would exist through all of time. All right. Now we see some more stuff going on. In verse 7, we change gears again. A war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. Who's the dragon?
Rome.
Rome, right? If you think that it's Satan, then you get all kinds of weird ideas about a war in heaven and angels and Satan and his angels fighting against each other, and God has civil war going on in heaven, and he doesn't have the ability to control heaven. Really, really lowers a human's opinion of God if you view it that way. But we know that the dragon is Rome. So what happens is he's defeated, the great dragon is thrown down, and then we have Satan, who is there, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to earth. So Satan was working with Rome here. Who was the one behind the sin of persecuting the church?
Satan.
Satan, right? Satan was there the entire time. Now we have a decree that salvation and power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. And look at what it says in verse 10. The accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. Whenever you go back to the book of Job, what do we see Satan doing at the very beginning of that book?
Having a conversation with God.
He has a conversation with God, and what is he doing with Job? Or about Job?
Well, he's
Talking.
He's talking with God about Job, right? He says he's going to and fro upon the earth, and then he starts talking to God about Job. Well, you've got a hedge around him. Take that hedge down and let me at him. You're protecting him. Let me at him. If I do this, he will not stay faithful to you. He was accusing Job in front of God of not going to be faithful if God took that hedge down. He does the same thing with us today. Have you considered Dawson? Have you considered Devin? Have you considered Anna? I can get them away from you. He's telling God, I am able to take these people away. If we are faithful to God, that will not happen. The same way that it went with Job. Verse 11, they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb. So the ones that have been accused by God, the ones that are in a position to be enveloped by Satan's wiles, we are capable of overcoming only by the power of the blood of Christ. We see rejoicing, and all right, we need to make more time. Verse 13, whenever he saw he'd been thrown down, he pursued the woman who had given birth. Whenever Satan realized that Jesus had overcome him, his only alternative after Christ had arisen from the grave, he thought he had won by killing Jesus, but actually Jesus rose from the grave by his own power, became the Savior of all humanity by doing so, and then ascended into heaven. Satan was left with one option on the table. What was it?
The church.
The church. All right. Everybody else is already not a child of God. I've got to go after the church. So that's what he did. He realized what his options on the table were, and he's pursuing the church, trying to take them away from God. The woman was able to get away, and again, we see in 15, Satan tries to do everything he can to get the church, but God protected the church. And we see that happen today. Satan is going to throw everything he has at the world, continuing to envelop them in sin more and more and more to get them to the point where they refuse to come back to God. But he throws everything he has at the church, especially, to get them away from God, to get them into his traps. And if we will do the one thing we have to overcome him and rely on God and God's strength and the blood of Christ, then we can overcome those traps and those tricks that Satan is using to try to pull us away. In 17, the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and to hold to the testimony of Jesus. We see a differentiation here between the church herself as an entity and the individual offspring of her. There's a difference between going after the church as a whole and going after individual members. The only option on the table at this point for Satan, he's gone after the church as an entity, realized he cannot get rid of the church as an entity. It's here to stay forever. So his only option on the table is to go after the individual members of the church. He's never going to get them all, but he's going to do everything he can to drag away every single one that he possibly can. And that's you and me. That's everybody in this room, everybody out here, and everybody in every congregation that is faithful to God on the face of the planet. He is going after us individually. But the same thing still remains on the table. Relying on God, we can overcome anything he throws at us. In chapter 13, we see another shift. A beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. I believe this is Rome again. What I really want us to focus in on is the blasphemous names on its head. What is blasphemy?
Lies.
It's more than lies.
To speak against God.
Pretty much. That's a pretty good street definition of it. It's to say something specifically against God. So this is a directly opposed entity that is opposing God. We have some description that's similar to what we see in Daniel's vision whenever he had an apocalyptic vision. Verse 3, one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. A lot of people argue about what that mortal wound is, but either way, it's something where they thought that it wouldn't recover, but it did. That could have been several things through Rome's history. I tend to lean toward, there was a point in their history after this was written, they shifted from idolatry, pagan idolatry, to adopting Christianity as the religion of the empire. Emperor Constantine is the one that did that. That seemed like something that would throw the entire empire into chaos. Like that could be a mortal wound that the entire country or empire never came back from. But it did. It lived for quite a while longer after that. And then was eventually destroyed because of its sin. But for whatever reason, it looked like it wasn't going to recover, but Rome did. They worshiped the dragon. He had given his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast and who can fight against it?" How was Rome defeated? They got lazy, number one. They adopted some less than stellar military ideas. They changed up some weapons, got out of the habit of fighting, and then they got their world rocked by an enemy army that came in and kicked their tail. They were being punished by God through another country's army to destroy them because of their sin. Because of all the things that their country did, that was very similar to what Babylon did, to what Greece did, what the Medo-Persian Empire did. They were one after the other punished by God through providence because of their sin. Same thing was going to happen to them. But they're saying here, who can fight against it? Rome seemed like an unstoppable steamroller if you tried to go against them. Whenever the Jews went against Rome, what happened?
Got captured?
Oh no, they got killed. They got squashed as a nation and never ever recovered. Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, and almost 1 million people were killed in that war. 1 million Jews. So the Jews tried to rise up against Rome, they got squashed. Anybody that tried to rise up against Rome, they got squashed. But eventually they got to a point where everybody was saying, who can fight against Rome? They're unstoppable. No, they weren't, because they're gone now as an empire. The beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words. One of the things that was blasphemous that they said, that was a prominent idea in Rome, was that the Caesar was a god. A lot of nations did that with pagan religions. They took their leader and elevated them to the position of a deity. So they would say, Caesar is a god. You need to worship this man. Well, that in and of itself is blasphemy, because God is the only living God, right? So if you say, I am a god, you are uttering a blasphemous statement. It was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. It seems like if we go back and look at the beginning of this book, that Rome is being allowed to win, fighting the church, right? I mean, they killed Antipas. They've killed others at this point. They're going to continue to kill more and more people. They're going to end up throwing a bunch in the Colosseum to get eaten by lions and killed by people with swords. It looks like they're winning. But in the end, the Christians are the ones that are winning. We'll talk about that here in a second. If anyone is to be taken captive, in verse 10, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with a sword he must be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. Whenever you go back to Lamentations and Jeremiah and Babylon rolling in to Jerusalem, sieging it, people starving to death, and then Babylon comes over the wall and starts raping and killing everybody inside. Who was in that crowd that has a book of the Bible to their name? Besides Jeremiah.
Daniel?
Daniel, right? Was Daniel a follower of God?
Yeah.
Sure seems like it. He sure acts like it. He had to be a follower of God. He was inspired, and we see him doing godly things from the beginning of that book all the way to the end. Did Daniel do anything to deserve being subjected to being in that crowd whenever Babylon rolled in?
No.
Not that we see. But yet he was still carried off and made a slave. Right? Were there Christians here suffering things that they didn't deserve?
Yeah.
Yes, but he says, here's a call for endurance and faith. If you're a saint, you need to remember this is a call for endurance and faith. The theme of the entire book is just spelled out for us right here. If you're into Bible marking, I suggest you highlight that or put a star by it or underline it or do something to call attention to that verse, because that is the theme of the book spelled out for us. He sees another beast rising out of the earth. Some people argue that this is a shift in Rome. I believe that this second beast is most likely the Roman Catholic Church being formed, because they became one and the same whenever Constantine adopted Christianity as Rome's religion. That's why it's called the Roman Catholic Church. It had 2 horns like a lamb. Who is the lamb that we have seen thus far in the book of Revelation?
Christ.
Christ, right? Christ. We've seen him described multiple times as the lamb that was slain. But here we see something that is not a lamb. It is like a lamb. It has 2 horns like a lamb. What does the Pope claim to be in the church.
The speaker for God?
Yeah, that's not exactly how they describe him, but that's one of the things. There's something else that he calls himself, though. The Pope is called the Vicar of Christ on earth. A vicar, I had to look this up. A vicar is a person that acts on their behalf, or a person that acts in the role of. So essentially, that is a way of saying that he is Christ's special representative on earth. He is a person taking the role of Christ on earth. And oh yeah, that brings up some weird, confused looks and how do you get by doing that kind of thoughts. Well, that's what he is, and that's what the Pope has been for well over 1,000 years. It spoke like a dragon. Whenever the Pope speaks, does he say some good things every once in a while?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have popes throughout history said a lot of terrible things that Satan loved? Yes. Very much so. It exercised all the authority of the first beast in its presence and makes the earth and its inhabitants to worship the first beast whose mortal wound was healed. I am utterly astounded at the amount of idolatry that has remained in the Roman Catholic Church as a holdover from pagan religions such as the old Roman forms of worship. They have statues that they have all over the place. They kiss the toes of statues. They treat the Pope like he is more than a mere man. I could go on about that for a while, but I'll cut it off there. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven in front of the people, and by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. There are Pope statues all over the place. There's a Pope statue over, I believe, in Rome, somewhere around the Vatican, whose toe is gone. He has bare feet on the statue, and his big toe is gone because so many human beings have walked up to it and kissed its toe as a sign of respect and love and adoration, that its toe has disintegrated over time through all the friction of people's lips touching it. It's disgusting, first of all, but it's also a sign of there's something wrong here because there's this image. It would be an idol if it was a calf or anything else, but it's a human being, so they don't call it an idol, even though it is. And they are kissing and paying homage to this image. That's just one little sign we can see of a modern day version of this going on. The same thing was going on back then. It was allowed to give breath to... Oh, hold on. Let's look at what it was doing with the signs. It was deceiving those who dwell on the earth. How many people believe that they are doing what God wants while they're ultimately doing the work of Satan because they have given themselves over to Catholicism? Like, not to hammer on Catholicism more than any other denomination, because they're essentially just another denomination, but they are the first denomination of prominence that we see here that's still in existence today. So they are responsible for leading a great many millions of people astray, doing what Satan wants, while people are deceived, thinking they're doing the right thing. It causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, slave and free, to be marked on the right hand or on the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That is the name of the beast or the number of its name. There's people that differ on what this is, and I will just put two options out there to you both. I'll put them both out there. On one hand, whenever Rome was in power, they had a Caesar who put out a rule. I can't remember the name of the Caesar or the year, but he put out an edict that if you wanted to sell or run a business, you had to sign a document saying that Caesar was God and that you would worship him. That's all you had to do. You didn't have to actually follow through on that afterwards, but you had to sign that document to be able to do business. And if you didn't, you weren't allowed to do business. Some believe that that is what the mark of the beast is. On the other hand, if it's the Roman Catholic Church that they're talking about here, How many people were forced out of business by the Roman Catholic Church because they would not toe the line to what the Roman Catholic Church believed that they should do? Don't have an exact number for you, but a great many people throughout the period of history. So, depending on who it is, those are the two options on the table. It doesn't really matter. Do not get caught up on thinking that it is social security numbers or barcodes or microchips or anything else modern day doomsdayers try to say the mark of the beast is. It is none of those things. Because the people in the 1st and 2nd century AD here would not have benefited at all from being told that people are going to be barcoded and microchipped and have social security numbers. It would do no good. So those are the two most prominent options on the table. You can kind of choose between them, but get the same general idea that either the Romans or the Roman Catholic Church here were going to force people out of business. The Jews have been doing this for a long time already before they were destroyed in 70 AD. This is just a modern continuation of what the Christians were having to face at this time. Now, let's go into 14 for a bit. We see the 144,000 on Mount Zion with God and the Lamb. They were sealed like we see earlier in the book. Let's look at the 144,000 in verse 4. It's described as those who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. If these follow the Lamb, or it is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes, they have been redeemed for mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb, and in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless. A really good, intimate description of purity. We don't see any blame or sin laid to these people. And that is the same way we are if we are washed by the blood of Christ, right? No one is a Christian that has sin still on their spiritual garments. If you are, then you have went away from God and not allowed the blood of Christ to continue to cleanse you, like we read about in 1 John. So you have fallen away if that happens. So that is a good description of how we should view ourselves as Christians if we are being faithful to God. Right? Despite all of our weaknesses, all of our flaws throughout the history of our lives, if we are living the way that we should, in step with God, walking in the light, then we are clean and pure. No fault can be found with us. We see a message from 3 angels. An angel flies directly overhead with an eternal gospel. Look at those 2 words very carefully. An eternal gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. What is the eternal gospel? Without even reading any further, what is the eternal gospel that needs to be proclaimed to the entire world?
The Bible.
Right. More detailed than that.
Gospel of Christ.
All right, the gospel of Christ. That Christ came to this earth, died for us, and we are only able to be saved through his blood. That's the only name in which we can be saved. That is the gospel that needs to be carried through the Bible to the rest of the world. I'm going to try to mark that and remember to start there. All right, any questions? Keep reading. Try to get through 16 next week, and I don't think we'll go past 16, but try to get to that point if you can.